Right, so welcome to the final Korean Studies colloquium of this this calendar year. And I can tell you right off the bat that we're going out with a bang. I think most of you know me, but my name is Youngju Ryu, and I'm the director of the Nam Center for Korean Studies. And I would like to thank all of you for the gift of your time on this very dreary and rainy Michigan afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing the speaker today, Christine Hong, Professor of Critical and Ethnic Studies, Professor of Literature, and the Director of the Center for Racial Justice at UC, University of California, Santa Cruz. And that is just the beginning of a very remarkable bio. Professor Hong serves on the board of the directors of the Korea Policy Institute, co-chairs the UC Ethnic Studies Faculty Council, and co-edits the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. Along with Deanne Borshay Lim, she co-directed the Legacies of the Korean War Oral History Project. She also co-edited a 2-volume thematic issue of Critical Asian Studies on reframing North Korean human rights, a special issue of Positions Asia Critique on the Unending Korean War, and a forum of the Abusable Past on White Terror, Red Island, a People's Archive of the Jeju Sasam Uprising and Massacre. Professor Hong's book, A Violent Peace, Race, Militarism, and Cultures of Democratization in Cold War Asia and the Pacific, published by Stanford University Press in 2020, was recognized as a winner of the 2022 award for Best Book in Humanities, Culture Studies, Literary Studies by the Association for Asian American Studies. And I believe her talk today will draw on the last chapter of that amazing book. So now that I've read her official bio, indulge me and let me add a couple of personal thoughts. I first met Christine more than a decade ago at a conference she co-organized on Unending Korean War. The conference brought together Asianists and Asian Americanists on the topic of the Korean War and engaged them in a meaningful dialogue. And I would tell you, as someone who's been in Asian studies for a long time, that is no small feat in and of itself to get these two groups together and actually talk in an impactful way. I heard Christine speak at that conference for the first time, and I said to myself, now there's a woman who is going to conquer the world. And as a fellow Korean American woman, it's going to be a treat for me to watch her do it and bask in her fiery brilliance. Well, lucky for all of us that she was less interested in conquering the world than in bringing the conquerors to justice. Right? The imperial conquerors of the past and the would-be conquerors of our multiple worlds in the present. She has performed that work, justice work, tirelessly and at a great cost to her own personal advancement. The example she has set as a committed intellectual challenges the armchair revolutionary in all of us. And so it is truly an honor to be bringing her here and to be introducing her to you today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Christine Hong.
Youngju, thank you so much for inviting me here to join you all. Thank you all for coming out. Suyun, thank you so much for arranging all the details. I have to say that my perception of Youngju is of someone who has rare and precious brilliance. And every time she speaks, literally your ear tilts in a very different way. And but thank you so much for your kind remarks. It's very true. You have pathways at the start of your career, and you can choose what you are going to do. And taking the road of public engagement comes with considerable risks. I wanted to just talk, to draw from a chapter in this book, and it originally was the Coda. And in this book, I was really interested in trying to think through how to understand the compositional nature of U.S. militarism. And to understand that U.S. militarism takes a certain form, and that form preoccupied, for example, Black radical thinkers in the middle part of the 20th century. And what they understood about that form, and that form was really race within the confines of militarism, or race within militarized contours, rather than understanding that as a stage in a process which the United States held out to the world as democratization. Black radicals understood it to be genealogically of something that they critiqued as U.S. fascism. And so with regard to this particular chapter, one thing that propelled it was Lieutenant Dan Choi. And for those of you who are really young, you might not recall who he is, but he is someone who, in the wake of 9/11, came out during a time when there was a policy, don't ask, don't tell. But he came out as gay and was honorably discharged from the military. But I will speak about this because there was something about the way that he presented himself ceaselessly, actually, that was so striking in the public arena. He always came out in uniform, even after having been discharged. And I wanted to think about that composition of race within militarized form. So it's just some backdrop. So having come out on the Rachel Maddow show in 2009, Lieutenant Dan Choi, a West Point trained Arabic linguist and former Army infantry officer who had signed up for service in the wake of 9/11, and he was arguably the most prominent advocate against and casualty of the infamous DADT policy, repeatedly thereafter, for the interval of a few years, publicly presented himself in military uniform, even after being honorably discharged. So he was coming out, but he was doing so under the cover of uniform. Coming out, but under the cover. Let me see. So in an op-ed in The Advocate, he described the military, in his words, as the front line in Americans' battles for equal treatment under the law. And so here you see a kind of pattern, a time-honored rhetorical presentation of militarized sacrifice as the basis for America's expansion of its quote-unquote more perfect union. So, and there's a civil rights trajectory here too. He talks about the African-American civil rights movement and this belief that U.S. wars grant historically marginalized populations their rights. That war is an opportunity when race can seize its rights. And that this function of the military in expanding the terms of U.S. democracy is essential to its democratizing function. And so what he wrote in The Advocate is, for the first time, the possibility of being considered full citizens of the United States is a clearly visible goal. And this is just one step in that journey. And so there's this bedrock conviction that he had at the start of his activism. And it was a bedrock belief in the democratic nature of the military as an institution. He was no radical. He was squarely institutionalist in his views. And he also believed, and his language indicated as much, in the U.S. war machine's moral recuperability. Okay. So you could see here that time and again, I've just chosen a few images, he was coming out in full military regalia. Okay. And as time passed, so from like 2010 to about 2013, you could trace in his media statements a growing disillusionment. And you could see that in the Huffington Post in late March of 2013, he stated, "It's hard to know that all of a sudden, I'm the terrorist. In the Army, we called activists very bad names, and now I'm them." So there's something interesting that was happening here. And if we scrutinize this more closely, Choi's casting of his demilitarized self in enemy terms suggested a discomforting blurring of the friend-enemy distinction with regard to race-marked subjects. Even as U.S. wars have served as the ideological impetus for expanded national unity, with opposition to various enemies catalyzing broad multiracial configurations of what it means to be American, race unsettled his act of coming out as a gay American soldier. Insofar as race had to be covered, I would argue that it remained obstinately queer. And I also want to say this too, that Black radicals during World War II understood that there was an operative enemy function, and that the sort of devil function or the devil principle served to catalyze national unity in decisively non-economic terms. And they understood this to be fascist war unity. So this entire sort of expansion of the terms of the nation, it's broadened diversification during a time of U.S. wars. Instead of understanding that as liberal multiculturalism, Black fascists would have recognized that as fascistic war unity. So let me say this. So once inside the war machine, Choi was now, by his own account, externalized as its target, and you could trace his increasing alienation in the frequency with which he began to don civilian attire. Okay, let me just say this though. But hoping to re-enlist, he repeatedly showed up in this military regalia, and rather than thinking of the uniform as somehow protective of race-marked subjects, I think that we should think about it, the uniform, as a neutralizer of difference. So betokening the prospect of full national inclusion, the uniform Choi donned post-discharge suggested its ideological potency as a nationalist shield, a form of cover that, in theory, neutralized difference. So the legal scholar Letty Volpe stated that in the wake of 9/11, so many people of color New York cab drivers draped themselves in the U.S. flag. And she noted that the U.S. flag draped the dwellings, workplaces, and bodies in an often fruitless attempt at demonstrating their loyalty, and that the very act of donning or draping yourself in the flag underscored the profound racial vulnerability of the subjects who were doing this. And you could understand in a way that the flag substituted as a kind of nationalist skin of sorts. And so the urgency with which Lieutenant Dan Choi appeared in uniform post-discharge likewise indicates that the act of coming out for him did not correspond to the story of the uncovered self. Rather, race persisted as something requiring concealment. Rarely, however, has his coming out in uniform been understood as a story about race under the sign of war, or a story demanding theorization of the military uniform's post-racializing work. And so what he was subscribing to, and you could see it from his statement, not this one, but the prior one, is that racialized life within militarized contours signals a stage in a gradualist schema that teleologically eventuates in democracy. So I wanted to speak about a debate that Dan Choi took part in with the queer anti-war activist Matilda Bernstein Sycamore. And this was a staged debate on the show Democracy Now! And what happened was Matilda Bernstein Sycamore basically stated that, Dan Choi talks about the fact that gay soldiers are victimized by not being included in the military. But Matilda Bernstein Sycamore states, but all the world is a victim of the U.S. military. So if there's one culprit that we should be pointing at, it's the U.S. military. And as a queer movement, and this is what Matilda states, what we need is a movement for gender, sexual, social, political, and cultural self-determination for queers, for everyone in this country, for everyone all over the world. We don't need to support the U.S. war machine, which is busy plundering indigenous resources, fighting multiple wars simultaneously, and all for corporate profiteers. And Matilda Bernstein Sycamore brings up a point that Dan Choi brings up in the debate about, well, war is sometimes the only option for queer youth in the middle of America. It's one of their only ways out. And this is what Matilda states. Well, queer teen suicides is an epidemic that's been happening for a long time. And what the fight for the fight against DADT is telling our queer youth is, well, don't kill yourselves now. Wait, enlist in the military, go abroad, kill and terrorize people of color all over the world. What kind of social justice is this? So this is something that was part of the debate. And I'd like to play this. Let me see. Okay.
Do not think that when we join the military we're just going to kill people of color. I certainly did not think that as a person of color. And as my mom is an orphan of the war, she certainly told me that you're...
Can you hear that? Is there a way? Okay. Okay. I think it's max volume on here, but let me see.
Your job in the military.
Oh. Do you? I'm sorry.
Do not think that when we join the military we're just going to kill people of color. I certainly did not think that as a person of color. And as my mom is an orphan of the war, she certainly told me that your job in the military is not to create havoc, but is to do everything that you can possibly, at least theoretically, to create peace to some extent. And that is, I know this is going to sound like fingernails on the chalkboard to some of your viewers, but war is a force that gives us meaning. War is a force that teaches us lessons of humanity and allows us to realize something about our society and teaches us the lessons that we probably should have learned before we went to war.
Matilda Bernstein-Sycamore, your response.
Well, when Dan Choi says that war is a force that gives us meaning, I want to know what is the meaning of the U.S. obliterating Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan? What is the meaning of soldiers pressing buttons in Nevada in order to destroy entire villages? You know, the meaning is that the U.S. is involved in wars for corporate profit and oil resources. And
so I just wanted to share a snippet of this debate that was happening in live time back in the day, and to give you a sense of the arguments that were being put forward. And this here is to note that the Korean War has retroactively been seized as a civil rights watershed. And I'll share something in just a moment. Let me see.
Do not think.
Oh. So you could see here that in 2013 on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., President Barack Obama, speaking to an audience of Korean War veterans and also dignitaries from the Park Geun-hye government, gave a speech called Heroes Remembered. Not only did Obama state that the Korean War was a victory, okay, a war that every historian understands resulted in a stalemate, but not only did he declare that it was a victory, but he also stated that the lesson of the Korean War was that the United States would remain the world's strongest military, bar none, always. That is a direct quotation. And but the way that he was recuperating the progressive meaning of the war was by turning to the fact that Truman's executive order that integrated the U.S. military was realized not because he issued that executive order. It was that the battlefield prompted an uneven realization of the integration of U.S. forces. And so many people who were fighting against DADT used the Korean War as a historical example of a moment in which the military led the way, even before Brown versus Board of Education, in desegregating, desegregating, in this case, U.S. fighting forces. And so this is what Obama stated. He stated that the Korean War helped point the way toward the ideas of equality and opportunity. Again, making a democratizing argument for the Korean War. And observing that on Truman's orders, quote, our troops served together in integrated units, he argued that the heroism of African Americans in Korea and Latinos and Asian Americans and Native Americans advanced the idea. If these Americans could live and work together over there, surely we could do the same thing here. And he continues, he says, and it's a gradualist argument, change came slowly. And we continue our long journey toward a more perfect union. But he says, but as we traverse this pathway, we have to give thanks to the Korean War veterans who were in the vanguard of civil rights reform. So, okay. His message was that Korea taught us, the war taught us, that as a people, we are stronger when we stand as one. And for those of you who've been to the National Mall, you realize that there are multiple steel statues there. They're about 7 feet tall. And if you look at the national park's description, there is a very belabored accounting of the race and ethnicity of each one. So even though their presentation, like the uniform, serves as kind of post-racializing cover, there is an assiduous breakdown in terms of the National Mall's description. So let me say this too. Even during the mid part of the 20th century, the Korean War was held out as having democratizing potential here domestically. So there was a 1954 government-backed report that was called Breakthrough on the Color Front, and it framed the Korean War as a salutary social experiment, hailing military desegregation as a living example of democracy in action that had, quote, changed the complexion of the armed forces and betokened by extension the inevitable transformation of U.S. civil society. So if the war was fought to a bitter draw, and so this report didn't attempt to suggest, as Obama did, that the war was a victory, this report still maintained that the Korean War was a social engineering triumph. This is a quotation. On the battlefields of Korea, on America's fighting ships and planes, and at its bases at home and abroad, a victory has been forged in one of the most significant social wars in the nation's history. So, propagated in this way as a pioneering advance toward full minority inclusion, the Korean War, notwithstanding its extraordinarily dirty, asymmetrical nature, was heralded as a staging ground for civil rights reform, and the military was championed as a leveler of unequal social relations. And so the question that I pose is, rather than casting back to the Korean War as a racially liberal watershed, how might we understand it instead as a paradigmatic project of Cold War racial securitization? How might we retrieve from it a non-triumphalist account of militarized queerness? And so I think one thing that's interesting to me is there are studies that look at Black GIs in the Korean War. There are studies that look at Latino GIs in the Korean War. There are critical adoption studies, scholarship. There is scholarship that looks at the role of child mascots. There are a few studies that look at animal mascots. And the Korean War was the last U.S. intervention in which the practice of human mascotry was tacitly indulged. But there are no studies that question what are the lines of continuity between these non-normative life forms that are deployed in various ways, but in sometimes overlapping ways, in the Korean War battlefront. So I wanted to, go to this. Claudia Jones, during World War II, heavily criticized the U.S. war, participation in the war, as being profoundly undemocratic. And the key question was the double V question. And the double V campaign was a campaign that was promoted by the black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, and other black newspapers. And the question that was posed was not the one that historians retrieve today. A lot of times historians today will say that the Double V campaign was victory against racism abroad and victory against racism at home. What they miss is that it's not just victory against racism, it's victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism and fascism domestically. So within even relatively mainstream black popular discourse during World War II, there was a strong political understanding that Jim Crow was fascistic. And the question was, how could you ask segregated forces to go fight against fascism and racism in the European theater when there wasn't democracy domestically? How could you do this? And so Claudia Jones wrote this piece, Jim Crow in Uniform, but basically calling our attention to the fact that Jim Crow in uniform, or race within militarized form, was one way that we could identify U.S. fascism in action. Right? But I want to say something too, which is that race within militarized form, there's competing definitions for this. And the way that the United States framed, for example, the Japanese American concentration camp, right, was that it was democratizing, that it would actually, it would desegregate Japanese Americans who were living in West Coast Little Tokyos and actually spread their numbers across the United States. So the concentration camp, which was surrounded by barbed wire, was framed as a democratic experiment. This is during FDR's time, actually. It's part of the New Deal, right? And so the United States, against the interpretation of militarized spaces, of race within militarized spaces, in critical ways, the U.S. concentration camp, the bombed-out cityscapes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the front lines of U.S. interventionist wars, and the U.S. military uniform were coded as sites of democratic opportunity for racialized subjects, both foreign and American. So you could see here that there's this trajectory from Jim Crow in uniform to desegregation on the Korean War front. And this is heralded as democratic progress, despite the fact that the Korean War led, according to Bruce Cummings, to 7 million dead. 4 million dead. And according to even people like Curtis LeMay, he gloated about the fact that through bombing, at least 20% of the peninsula's population was slaughtered. There are some Chinese statistics that indicate that North Korea's loss was approaching 30%, right? And so how do you understand this as democratic progress? So I wanted to mention this too. So the inception of this project has many inceptions, but part of it was actually doing research at the Library of Congress on Ralph Ellison. And so during World War II, prior to writing Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison credited a work that he called the Airman novel with being the blueprint for Invisible Man. And there was such a strange plot line for this. It was that a black airman, a Tuskegee-like airman, was shot down over the European theater, captured. Because he was an officer, he was incarcerated in an Oflag by the Nazis. Because he was the highest ranking military official there, he had command authority over the other Americans. And when the Americans tried to Jim Crow conditions, the Nazi command would not permit it. So it's a very strange story that's only in bits and parts. But for him, because of the double V resonance, this description of a black officer who is held captive within militarized contours in a POW camp was meant to be a metaphor for the United States. And so the term that he used was democracy within the teeth of fascism. And that's how he understood militarized, the coercion of fascism, but also some political possibility. And so democracy within fascism, or race within militarized form, requires neutralization of racialized threat in order for those subjects to live. So I'm going to just actually move on because in the interest of time, let me just see. Yeah. I'll just say that you could see that North Koreans actually in battlefield propaganda directed their conversation directly to black soldiers. And you can see that this is a conversation to no small degree between differently targeted populations. It's the target, North Koreans speaking to black soldiers as cannon fodder and stating, your war isn't here, your war is at home. And in doing this, North Koreans were actually in conversation with black radicals in the United States. You can see verbatim the use of language. And I have more to say about this, but I will skip over this. And so here, what I am proposing to do is to think through constellated forms of non-normative militarized life circa the hot fighting era of the Korean War, war orphans, military mascots, desegregated troops. And so I want to actually go to the way that U.S. intervention was framed. And mascots invariably were understood as being orphans. And they were very, their status was extraordinarily slippery. But you could see that GI humanitarianism really turned upon the perception of GI benevolence, a kind of paternalistic regard for orphans and mascots. So you could really see that the Korean War, like why are these kids orphaned, in the first place? That question is never asked. But you could see that the humanitarian face of the Korean War was the quote-unquote war orphan, even if the war orphan had extended family. And the obverse was indiscriminate U.S. targeting of civilian infrastructure. You can't understand the orphan without understanding that that is the conditioning backdrop. So time and again, there were media accounts that suggested the life-giving properties of U.S. military intervention. And you could see that time and again, these orphaned mascots would be decked out in miniaturized versions of U.S. military uniforms, time and again, time and again. There were also little girls who were mascots, and they were given names like Baby Sun, which was a way of referring to militarized prostitutes during that time. But this is what I would just say about these mascots. Imagined as without kin and stripped of prior social bonds, mascots, as deracinated forms of life, were revealingly made over in the occupier's image. So you could see that they are deterritorialized life, re-territorialized in the occupier's image. By disrupting a semiotics of disloyalty, connecting them to the enemy from whom they were otherwise racially indistinguishable, and performing fidelity to the occupying power, their visual transformation was key to their racial securitization. Even while demarcating its wearers as targets in combat, by assigning them right of place behind the line, the uniform performed a shared esprit de corps with the military occupiers. So there's a memoir by someone named Link White, who was a mascot. And he recalled that procuring fatigues was the first order of the business of survival. You had to get that. He said, if I wanted to become a mascot, then I had better look like one. And taking stock of how the other mascots were attired, he was able to finagle, beg, borrow, and steal a pair of the smallest sized khakis and, this is the term, a cunt cap from the unit's supply room. So even though he lacked identity papers, he described his altered GI uniform as a visual passport to safety. So in a world in which the killing of civilians, racialized as undifferentiated masses, was the norm, the mascot's life-giving mask was a pint-sized version of adult military fatigues. In the Korean theater, practices of undifferentiated viewing, like the target is undifferentiated, doesn't distinguish, right? Linked to indiscriminate extermination were sanctioned. Indeed, the target was perceived through a racial colonial optics. Shadowed by the specter of mass death, U.S. military uniforms thus served as a racial cover for child mascots, a surrogate for the flesh, inoculating them against predation by the U.S. war machine. Not safe in their own skin, uniformed mascots were thereby securitized in the sense of momentary deferral of future harm in this chaotic and very hazardous milieu of asymmetrical warfare. And so you could see some of the other headlines. Clutched from the grasp of starvation and death, saved by GI generosity. Troops give time, toil, and money. And you could also see, you could also see that not only are the GIs framed as benefactors versus destructive invaders, but these street waifs, urchins, these street kids are described as predatory and preying upon kind-hearted GIs. And you could see this kind of description here. So you could see that this is what I would say about this as a war remnant. If you think about Native American mascotry, what is the Native American mascot but a war remnant? So as a war remnant, a singularity whose obverse is the mass casualty, the Korean mascot hovered in a gray zone between friend and enemy as a form of queer life. In this 1951 Chicago Tribune article, war correspondent Walter Simmons cautioned against what he claimed were the predatory schemes of thousands of wolf children, some of whom were spies for the North Koreans. In their shoe shine boxes, some carry poison liquor, which has already killed 12 Americans in Seoul alone within the last few weeks. To such trained urchins, the tender-hearted GI was a marked man. Revealingly, U.S. military counterintelligence worried about the access that was granted to child mascots, framing them as figures whose allegiances could not be assured. the Army CIC, or Counterintelligence Corps, delivered lectures to troops instructing them not to fraternize with indigenous subjects, including South Korean employees with security clearance, and underscored especially the dangers of allowing children the free run of all positions. But the children weren't just running aimlessly through these encampments. The children, again, their status was blurred. And you could see I have a vast collection, and I'm not going to talk about the methodology of reading them right now, but I have a vast collection of GI war albums from the Korean theater. And mascots and orphans and street kids appear routinely. And you could see the description on the back of this photo, which I have, this phobic account. So I wanted to say something here too. You could see in this piece about this airman's houseboy who then gets adopted by the sergeant that he was serving, that many of these mascots performed significant reproductive labor for the U.S. military. And this is actually in keeping with Black GIs or Black servicemen during World War II who served as stevedores, cooks, who shined shoes, who peeled potatoes. There was reproductive labor for the U.S. military. Mascots performed this. So once located within the U.S. war machine, Korean war child mascots undertook domestic labor that was critical to the U.S. military's overseas reproduction, often one and the same as houseboys in the units to which they were attached. They were typically assigned housekeeping duties. Again, this is the province of Black servicemen who were relegated to labor battalions during World War II. Mascots took over a range of tasks, including, and this comes from a mascot's memoir, making beds, which required just straightening out their sleeping bags, covering them with army blankets, shining their shoes and belt buckles, taking and bringing back their clothes for the wash, sweeping the tent's dirt floor, and making sure the tent's stove was always fueled and the water cans always filled. And so there was a way in which, even in these hardship settings, the mascots performed a kind of labor of recreating a sense, a simulacrum of home away from home, right? They created a sense of comfort, right? So let me go on to this, because I want to just show some photos, and then I'm going to just open it up for questions. And thank you for bearing with me. Let me just... So these are some photos from my own collection. You could see that there's a sense of emotional intimacy. There's a sense of relationality. There's affect that is conveyed in these images. And there are other ones too. So produced by war violence, child mascots were rarely the fictive offspring of specific GI fathers. Rather, they are usually adopted by entire units, and they entered into queer kinship relations with the U.S. war machine. Their insider status was contingent provisionally on the war's chaos, insofar as ambiguous forms of intimacy emerged out of the neo-colonial encounter between South Korea and the United States. The mascot's function as surrogate kin was fraught with peril. As Tessa Morris Suzuki aptly states, the line between fraternization and infantilization, camaraderie and exploitation was thin. So these kinds of photos, which oftentimes are uncaptioned, prompt unanswerable and lingering questions for us. In some, the eroticization of the mascot's vulnerability is palpable, like here, right? The erotic, Sharon Holland reminds us, is the glue for racist order, conditioned by asymmetrical violence. Such images imply uncertain and unsettling feelings across the color line. And they register the queerness and the malleability of deterritorialized indigenous life. So I'm not going to, because I want there to be enough time, I'll just state that you could see that there are also the space of the Korean War battlefield was a space of beings in encounter. And you could see that in some cases, this horse, which was nicknamed Reckless after the recoilless rifle, was actually given multiple Purple Hearts, was transported to California and given honorary citizenship. This was not the only non-human animal to receive U.S. citizenship. So you could see limited personhood for non-human animals emerge geographically alongside human populations subjected to death. This is a bear, too, that received a Purple Heart and actually parachuted. This is a parachuting bear. And you could see that there was literally a K9 unit in Korea as well. And you could see, too, that, the dogs were disposable. Their labor was instrumentalized. In some select instances, they were treasured for a time, But let me just I'm going to end there and just say, so revisionist attempts to recuperate the Korean War as a pioneering civil rights advance have left to the side the U.S. war machine's flexible incorporation of Korean orphans and other forms of non-normative life, even though such examples of GI humanitarianism were widely propagated in their moment. As the last conflict in which the U.S. military tacitly permitted child mascotry, the Korean War generated spaces of beings in encounter, fostering the emergence of contingent communities. If multiracial and multinational, such war-forged associations were not co-constituted in a context of equality. Rather, human and animal mascots moved in hazardous milieus in which limited personhood for non-human animals emerged geographically alongside human populations subjected to death, as Neil Ahuja has theorized in other contexts. Indeed, some animal mascots were elevated as honorary citizens, while Korean waifs and urchins, although typically framed in U.S. media accounts as objects of charity, were phobically cast as wolves preying on kind-hearted GIs. So neither civilian nor soldier, human nor animal, kin nor stranger, child nor adult, American nor Korean, friend nor foe, beneficiary nor victim, alive nor dead, plaything nor labor, object of love nor object of sexual desire. The Korean War mascot indexed the U.S. war machine's production of biopolitical slippages between these categories. The story of the mascot as an enemy war remnant recuperated by and into the occupation forces is a tale of the Cold War securitization of race and indigeneity by the imperial war machine. If traced back to the practice of military mascotry circa the U.S. war in Korea, former Lieutenant Dan Choi's post-discharge insistence on donning full U.S. military regalia suggests that several decades following the battle phase of the as yet unresolved Korean War, race for the gay soldier of color remained that which required militarized masking. So I will end there. Thank you so much. And thank you for bearing with me. I'm a little under the weather, so my voice is like this. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I'm also happy to speak about, yes. Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for your time. I really enjoyed this presentation. I was wondering if the moral arguments and the use of mascots were meant to mostly appeal to the U.S. audience and how that affected the way that South Koreans view the U.S. military.
How I do think that the practice of mascotry was framed as GI humanitarianism and was geared toward a stateside and U.S. military audience. But you're asking if that conditioned how Koreans viewed mascots? Is that what you're saying? Or I'm. Mm-hmm. You know, if the practice of mascotry was tied to the overseas export of mixed race and Korean children, but Korean children in the first instance, if it was tied to that, was that viewed positively? It had an effect of organizing the biopolitics of the South Korean state formation. But it also was something that North Koreans targeted for critique. And the question that North Korea posed was, why are you exporting your children to imperialist countries? So I guess it depends on which Korea we're talking about.
Thank you, Christine. So it's not going to be a very well-formed, well-articulated question because it's something that I'm struggling with. But the idea of the mascot and the point at which the waif then transmutes into the wolf children is precisely the recognition by the American media or the American military of some sort of political will or some sort of economic will or some sort of agency on the part of the mascot that is independent of the war machine. And I'm interested in that question because there are so many, well, maybe not so many, but quite a few memoirs by former houseboys, former mascots, not the one that you mentioned by Link Perry, but that are published primarily in Korean, where the narrative is all about the agency of the houseboy and the opportunities that are opened up by the military in a manner that is not unlike Dan Choi's insistence on taking U.S. military to task for what it says it's going to do, which is to democratize the world, right? So my question is this. I'm struggling myself in my own overall work to think about positions and subject positions and agencies for, let's say somebody like the mascot,
Yeah.
So like for somebody like Surgeon Yo-Yo,
Mm-hmm.
that does not just fall into the naive or the fool category.
Yeah.
And I'm asking you if you have thoughts on that, or for your help in kind of thinking about a different positionality there.
I mean, I don't know if it is foolish or naive, because to ascend to that position, to make the argument for it through your actions, requires a kind of resourcefulness that is quite stunning, you know. And so to be able to figure out how to navigate, even like the back of that photo that describes the kids as lousy and, you know, scheming, suggests a kind of social intelligence, you know. So I wouldn't describe the mascot as a rube or a dupe. I would say that this is, you know, this is Tessa Moore Suzuki describes the shifting tectonic plates of the Cold War. And you know how you always hear and see, like, you know, the villages would bring out, like, you know, the South Korean flag. Then they bring out the, you know, like the switch flag for whoever's there. And, you know, it is something about those tectonic plates shifting, even with the battle lines morphing, meant that to survive, you had to have so much social alacrity. And to me, it's interesting to think through, like when I was initially looking at stuff on mascots, although there were some people who had written something about it, the biggest body of literature on mascots has to do with sports and Native American mascots. And thinking about how Korean mascots, animal, you know, and human, right? Like that they are, or, you know, we could say all animal, but like that they are indigenous life forms. There's something about that I find interesting, because, you know, Josephine Park uses that term that she gets from Derrida, the friendly, the Cold War friendly. And there's something about U.S. securitization that you could see. It always involves coercion. It's never about any kind of moralistic alignment. It's all about survival. And so ensuring that through military force there is a kind of alignment, you securitize a population, but you can never be sure, because it's coercive, of their loyalty. And so like the Cold War friendly flip-flops in terms of loyalty. And I think too, like with the mascot, how would you know? How would you know? And there is that term that comes from settler colonial critique, which is the refractory imprint of the native counterclaim. You know, and I feel like the mascot has that. Could I say one last thing, which is that if you are interested, there's a group of us who've been working for a number of years, and it started with some of us in the activist Hyun Lee. We created something called the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective. And we have been building a open access, public-facing syllabus. And it's available on the Korea Policy Institute website. But it's for people who are educators, but it's also people who want to study these materials as political education in organizing spaces. And it's also for independent study. But we have our first module up, and the module is not called Afterlives of the Korean War, because the Korean War is not over. It's called Reverberations. And please do check that out. And please, if you're interested in that, sign up for our newsletter, and we will keep you posted when we put out new modules.
Maybe it's a little bit of a deviation from your presentation,
Okay.
but I was thinking of North Korean orphanage who were sent to the Eastern European countries during the Korean War and sent back into the North Korea during the 1960s.
Yep.
What if we put those orphanages into your framework?
Well, first of all, people don't seem to recognize that the Korean War being a total war, you know, I mean, like, we know now that Lee Seung-man weaponized children on the battlefront, and there were about 5,000 child soldiers. And if you go to North Korea, you can also see that children participate in the war effort. You know, there's exhibits that are dedicated to that. But you're very right that the method of what North Korea did, I mean, given that North Korea was utterly razed, you know, it was razed to the point that people had to live underground. The fact that North Korea really had basically 3 different methods of dealing with what we might now call child precarity or unaccompanied minors, right? And so one way, when I've been to North Korea twice, and one time it was to examine how, in the wake of the 1990s famine, North Korea had to reanimate its babies' homes and children's homes. And so that is one method, you know. And then another one was with extended family members, you know. And then the other way is exactly as you said, the sending abroad throughout the socialist bloc of children with North Korean nurses so that the kids would not lose their Korean language skills, and then bringing them back once the country was reconstructed. Now that is a profoundly different approach. And, you know, I'm not well versed enough to say, but socialist biopolitics are not the same as capitalist biopolitics. And so there's research to be done there. And the fact that those histories are different gave North Korea the perch to resoundingly criticize South Korea in the successive decades after the hot fighting period of the Korean War, to say, why the hell are you still exporting kids? You know? Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm curious to know more about, I think there was a slide up there and I caught a glimpse of it, talking about the siblings, specifically the female siblings of mascots. And I think there was like a little blurb up there from a GI's like diary entry or something saying like these kids pimp out their sisters. So I'm curious to know more about maybe the role of female children and if that was the only kind of responsibility they had, and the relationship between the mascots and their sisters specifically.
You know, there was a chronological continuum between some of the girl mascots and then women who were militarized prostitutes. And so, and have you ever read Heinz Insu Finkel's Memories of My Ghost Brother? It's a Vietnam War era account of South Korean camptown life. And it's semi-autobiographical, but structured as a novel. And he describes a continuation of that. And it wasn't just gendered. It wasn't like heteronormative in its non-normative sort of erotic relations. It was everything and anything. But I mean, this is also part of, you know, when you look at not only the Library of Congress materials with regard to the U.S., you know, occupation, not just that, but also South Korean headlines, news headlines. The way that Camptown women are described is as comfort women. So it's not a surprise now to say, oh, they're America's comfort women. It was the recognition all along, I would say. But this concept of comfort, I think we should scrutinize, because imperialist military forces require comfort to militarily reproduce themselves overseas, right? You know, I mean, I'm not romanticizing things, but you read different people and they say that by contrast, it's not that rape didn't happen, but North Korean, and Chinese volunteers did not rape on par with U.S. forces and South Korean forces. And that is anecdotally borne out time and again. And it was interesting because years ago, some of us interviewed Kim Dong-chun at, who had been the, what is it called? The standing commissioner of the TRCK, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Korea. And I asked him, I asked him, I said, to what degree did you investigate sexual and gendered violence? And he said, it's understandable that people would not want to come forward who had been victimized. He said, but it was a grave omission. He said, because by overlooking that, we lost an opportunity to analyze the state formation that emerged out of that violence. And if you think about that too, I mean, the fact that South Korea gained a reputation as a sending nation in terms of overseas adoption, so much so that the word adoptee was synonymous with being Korean, for years, for decades, you realize that there was an impoverishment of social services that would have enabled poor women, single women, to be able to keep their children.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it, and I love the book as well. I think this is kind of related to some of the questions that have already been asked, and it's not that well formulated either. But when you showed the Chicago Tribune editorial there, it was interesting. There was this note, like, these kids can make more in one day than the mayor of Seoul makes in 1 month, and that they have a henchman or whatever who's organizing them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the interesting things when we think about the unending Korean War is that after the Korean War as well, you still have these kinds of sort of social organization going on, and they're tied in different and varying degrees to...
You mean like the satellite economy around bases and what have you?
Yeah, but also it's even more broad than that. And so I suppose it's kind of an open question, but like to what degree does the mascotry kind of framework capture the broader sort of social reproduction of militarism that's going on in South Korea? If the examples aren't directly tied to U.S., they're often tied to U.S. structures and U.S. aid structures and U.S. money, but they're not always tied to camp towns or the U.S. military directly. And so I wonder if there are, what are there shortcomings in using a framework derived from the critical study of the United States in the world even. I mean, I know you're dealing with Asian American studies and critical ethnic studies, but I wonder, I mean, and that kind of gets to a larger question about the interaction of Asian American studies or American studies with Korean studies. But I wonder if you have any, it's not a good question at all. I'm sorry about that.
No. So, I mean, I can take strands if you don't mind. And one is the question about how capacious and flexible is the framework of the Mascot. And I don't know that it is. You know, it was, but I do think that it, you know, insofar as there is a kind, you know, this is like Lisa Dugan stuff on like marriage and the military, you know what I mean? Like, there's something about this sort of, you know, it is the kinds of ways in which the opening of the gates, you know, to diversify the military is almost always framed in progressive civil rights terms. So one thing that I wanted to do was to question that. This sort of transnational part is, as I said, there are studies of Black servicemen in Vietnam, in Korea, you know, in World War II. There are different accounts that do take national structure as a kind of delimitation. And by placing what I was calling constellated life forms in conversation with each other, I hoped to sort of shake that a little bit. I think the question of I'm very interested in thinking through the possibilities of a nexus between area studies and what I call the critical interdisciplines. And I think that there's something about Korean studies in particular, and maybe I'm overgeneralizing from my own experience, but both in terms of activist organizations and also having gone to grad school at Berkeley, I was able to partake in political education spaces. When I was at Berkeley, the only Koreanist who was there was John Lee, and he wasn't in East Asian languages and cultures. There was no one else. And so I worked with a Japanist who thought he was being funny in repeatedly calling Koreans "you people" to me. And so, you know, it's there was also something that was so striking to me, and I know that things have shifted somewhat, but it was the case that East Asian languages and cultures, there were so many older white men when I was a grad student who were on the tenure track, who were positioned as interpreters of Asian culture. To use Naoki Sakai's framing, theirs was a positionality of humanitas. By contrast, there were all these Asian woman lecturers who had PhDs in hand, but had close to zero security of employment. So there was a way in which Asian studies politically was playing out. And, you know, I'm not saying that this necessarily goes to content issues, but when I look at the Association for Asian Studies having a moment of awakening in the wake of the movement for Black Lives protests of 2020, and all of a sudden attempting to reckon in very feeble and totally inadequate ways with the racism of the field through fellowships for non-Asian people of color who work in the field, you know, various fields. as though that's the solution, without reckoning with the ways in which imperialism, national security considerations, other forms of epistemic violence are encoded into Asian area studies. And I think like we've had a series of situations in which Korean studies has been roiled by plagiarism scandals, by sexual harassment and violence, and by extractivist research, towards subjects that didn't know that they would be quoted, and or at least not to that degree. And rather than think of those as one-off situations that have to be dealt institutionally, what if we understood those as being part and parcel of a field that has reproduced itself in ways that have not been sufficiently critical? It's just a question I would pose. You can challenge me on this. Yeah.
I don't mean to challenge it, but I don't know if it speaks to a different concern of Koreanness with the use of frameworks that are reflective of in American studies scholarship or U.S. scholarship.
I don't know if I am so thoroughly untrained, and I have knee-jerk anti-disciplinary leanings. So I wouldn't say that my work reflects a disciplinary orientation. If anything, it's the den of wolves approach.
So just to continue this conversation about Asian studies and Asian Americans critique that is possible of Asian studies. The critique, I think, could also move in the other direction.
Yeah, please.
And I think for Asianists, one of the things that are kind of troubling about sort of Asian American interest, relatively recent, even though it's several decades old now, of, for example, Korean War, is a kind of an instrumentalization of the Korean War in where the main target or object of critique, but because it's the main object of critique, it's also the main object of interest, main addressee, main object of love and invested desire is America.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a formation there that feels oddly, and I'm going to be very devil's advocate here, that feels oddly instrumentalist and colonialist about people's scholarship that is very heavily invested in Korea, because that scholarship is actually being engaged to critique some other entity, right? Mm-hmm. Some other addressee that is seen as, and that other entity, of course, is the U.S. power.
But I don't see it as either or. I just don't. And I also don't think that it is a love of the United States, love, hate, like, although, it's mixed. I think that some of this work has not really been done before. So insofar, it's not a screw you how you're doing it. It's how do we understand war on the lower registers? And like when Kwon Chen speaks about de-imperialization and de-Cold Warring and decolonization, it's an open question how to enact those methodologically, right? So like I feel as though if there is an American orientation, it is also because the Korean War for both Asian American studies and American studies didn't register. American studies as an association formed in the early 1950s. And it was about civilizational, like US civilizational discourse with no reflection on the extraordinary violence. You know, its sort of point of reference was Europe, and you know, but it and a comparison there, and also with regard to Asian American studies, which emerges during the Vietnam War era, Korea is almost entirely bypassed, and it's not just a topic; it's actually trying to think through methodologically how differently can some of these. It's not even just Korea. You know, I'm part of the UC Ethnic Studies Faculty Council, and we think about like, how is it, you know, we're being told right now that we can't turn over any part of our class to discuss the genocide in Gaza. And if you do, you could be penalized. And the UC regents are attempting to wrest direct disciplinary authority over faculty. So the pedagogical questions about how you discuss imperialism in US universities is very real. And it's not just discussions. There's organizing that's happening. In the UC system, there are student organizations that have formed a group called UC Divest, trying to get the university to divest. I mean, I think, to me, I don't care if people criticize me for my investment in that kind of work. We don't have enough life, and these struggles, but they extend far beyond our lifetimes. And, but that is, I find that worthwhile work. Yeah.
Are there any other questions, audience? Okay. Well, we are right at 5:30. So thank you so much, Christine. It's been
Thank you.
eye-opening, to say the least. Yeah.